Aren't goblins great? We all love little goblins, right? Nothing makes an underground crypt into a proper dungeon like the pitter-patter of little goblin feet echoing through the halls. Plus, they're super cute, or horrific. Whatever mood you're after, goblins can fit it. And it's for those reasons and more that goblins have become a mainstay in fantasy at large, especially D&D. But what if we could make them better? This is the question that a group of drow wizards deep within the Underdark once sought to ask themselves. And of course, by better, they meant, well, you'll see. Hello and welcome to Monster of the Week, the only show on the internet that digs up old creatures from past editions of D&D, talks about why they're interesting, how you might use them in a campaign, and gives them a second chance in the spotlight by converting them to 5th edition. This week, we're headed to the Underdark to talk about that one time a bunch of drow tried to make Goblins 2, the new batch. And just to get this out of the way, for those of you that are familiar with the concept of drow flesh warping from Pathfinder, this isn't that, but it's not better. So say a quick prayer to Maglubiate and get ready to meet the 4th species of goblin that literally no one talks about, the Vril. Back in May of 2007, Wizards of the Coast released Drow of the Underdark, a 3rd edition book that was all about, you're never gonna believe this, drow and the Underdark. If you were trying to run a campaign that was predominantly in the subterranean world of the drow, this was the book you wanted to have. In addition to all the stuff you'd expect to see in this kind of book, there was also a small bestiary, which of course is where we're headed today. In a feature about goblinoid creatures and how they pertain to the drow, the book goes over how many drow basically enslave or coerce goblins and bugbears into service, sort of integrating them as something akin to a peasant army, which is drow speak for expendable shock troops. They never did mess with hobgoblins though, which was probably wise on their part. Before we jump into the Vril, one thing I do want to quickly show you is this new goblin stat block they introduced in this book that I think is particularly funny, the Goblin Flesh Herder. This is a goblin that's technically a necromancer, but their powers are limited to a degree, so their primary role within drow society is to direct the actions of undead laborers. In other words, a bunch of skeletons or zombies will be building a fortress or something, and one of these guys will just be hanging out, making sure the undead minions are doing what they're supposed to. And I just think that's so funny. This dude is literally a goblin with a goofy skull tattoo on his head. He's got a job in middle management. Anyways, the final part of this chapter is the reason we're here, which is the section that details a new species of goblin, the Vril. Vril are the product of arcane experimentation. Essentially, a group of drow wizards looked at their goblin minions and thought, I bet we could make them even more deadly. So through a lot of magical and genetic tampering on standard goblins, they eventually gave rise to what you see here. A species of goblin that was slightly larger with deep purple skin lined in black stripes to blend in with the shadows of the Underdark. They have massive bat-like ears to hear every sound that echoed off the massive cavernous walls, a mouth filled with more teeth, larger and sharper than before, arms that stretched below the creature's ankle to give them extra reach, and the final touch, a smidge of thunderous arcane might that allowed them to shatter rock and stone with a powerful screech. Also, they imbued them with an innate weakness to poison, so that if they ever got too powerful, the drow could always deploy their poisonous expertise to cut them down. All in all, a perfect upgrade to the base model, as far as the drow were concerned. While not quite as nimble as the goblins they progenerated from, the Vril were much stronger, more capable, and a lot smarter. In fact, I would argue their enhanced intellect is one of the most dangerous things about the Vril. Goblins can certainly be clever, but they often lack that sharpened edge of a skilled tactical wit when it comes to battle, and this is something the Vril have in spades. Rather than just diving into battle headfirst without much of a plan, barring the occasional ambush here and there, they will stalk and study their foes, formulating a plan of attack while they do so. Since they were created by drow to serve as soldiers, they were also trained by drow, meaning that the first Vril received some of the best combat training you could ask for. Combined with their natural abilities, it made them strong, maybe even a little too strong. See, Despite the fact that they had this built-in vulnerability to poison, many of the Vril were obviously not satisfied with a life of being subjugated and forced to be basically enslaved soldiers to the Drow wizards. Hard to blame them. Can't really imagine much fulfillment in a life of dying for a society that does not include you. So, some of them chose to slay their creators and escape into the Underdark, determined to cut out a path of their own. And those Vril have since populated the Underdark as a new species. Still small enough in number that they are not known to many on the surface above, but all of that might change very soon. Speaking of which, let's talk about just exactly what these purple goblins can do at the game table. On page 123 of the original book, we find the Vril stat block. Hang on a sec, it must be on page 124. Huh? Did I miss it somehow? What the hell's going on? So WotC goofed up a bit here and made a teensy mistake. Yeah, they just forgot to print the Vril stat block in the book. Which is especially funny, because the paragraph describing the Vril makes reference to the information provided in the stat block, which is just completely absent. I can only imagine how confusing this was at the time. I know it made me feel like I was being gaslit as I flipped back and forth between the pages multiple times, but only after Googling Vril stat block missing from Drow of the Underdark ? Did I discover that I was indeed not experiencing some kind of brain death, but that there was a goof made and a subsequent errata. This errata, of course, was only ever published online and is no longer hosted by Wizards of the Coast, but it is archived, so even if the webpage looks like this, all the information is still there and legible. If nothing else, I feel like this really highlights the importance of media preservation, because if it weren't for this archival website and this page, all of the information about the Vril, their abilities, and how they all work would have probably been lost. But I digress. As a species of goblin, much like all their other kin, the Vril isn't a creature that can be boiled down to a single stat block. So what I'm going to present you with here is the default Vril stats. Think of this like the default goblin stat block or the default hobgoblin stat block. It's just kind of an average representation of your typical Vril. Now, first and foremost, they are small, like the goblins they sprang from, though they're really riding the cusp between small and medium. Sort of like how a Goliath is just barely not large, the Vril is just barely not medium. They've got a climb speed, which is great for navigating those cavernous walls, and they have crazy good dark vision out to 120 feet. Also, thanks in part to their massive ears and echolocative abilities, they get blind sight out to 15 feet. And thanks to this magical sonic processing, they also have advantage on perception checks to hear stuff, are resistant to thunder damage, and cannot be deafened. They do, however, have that pesky sunlight sensitivity that many creatures in the Underdark inherit, which imposes disadvantage on attack rolls if their target is beyond their blind sight radius and in bright light. Speaking of attack rolls, the Vril's favored weapon of choice is a tool we don't see employed all that often: the War Pick. It smacks for 1d8 piercing damage, however they often opt to wield it with two hands, which means it's going to hit for a d10. What makes them especially unique in combat are their final two actions, the first of which is called Shriek. When the Vril uses its shriek, believe it or not, it shrieks loudly in either a 30-foot cone or a 15-foot radius centered on itself. All creatures in the area take some thunder damage, and if they fail their save, they also get deafened. If they happen to fail that save by 5 or more, they're also stunned for a turn, which is really bad. Getting stunned is obviously never a good thing, but getting stunned when you're facing off against a single enemy isn't the end of the world. However, being stunned when going up against a large group of enemies is especially heinous because it makes it way easier for all those other enemies to stab you to death. But hey, it's only a DC 13 saving throw because, after all, we're talking about a CR3 creature here. So what are the odds you roll under an 8? Depending on your character, not actually that low, but let's move on. The one saving grace here, though, is that this shriek only affects creatures who can hear. So if you do get stunned by it, there's a really good chance that you're also deafened, since the deafened condition lasts for 1 minute. So it's really unlikely you're going to get stunned multiple times within a single encounter unless it goes on for quite some time, or you unfortunately heal the deafened condition only to be shrieked and stunned again. Or if you're immune to it for some reason. Wouldn't that suck if you being immune to being deafened made it so that you were just getting clowned on by these creatures? Oh man. Now its second unique ability is a bonus action called Skin Shift. And this is a really unique defensive tool. Essentially once per day, the Vril can change the consistency of its skin, granting it resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing damage until it takes a long rest. So if it notices most of its opponents are using bows and spears, it's gonna choose piercing. If it's up against a bunch of knights with sword and axes, slashing. And if it's up against a cartoon character with a rolling pin, bludgeoning. This all makes for a competent little fighter who is a step up from the typical goblins we know and love in terms of challenge, but of course, there's always room to expand on this and make your own type of Vril. In my conversion, you will find 2 additional stat blocks for the Vril Leader and the Vril Bloodsworn, which are my take on a more powerful Vril in a leadership role and a Vril who has made a pact with some kind of entity. Who knows, maybe they even managed to strike a pact with Maglubiet himself, the god of goblins, thus securing their spot as a true member of the goblinoid species, bringing them into the fold. In fact, that can actually make for a really cool story. Let's talk about that. For those of you who aren't familiar with the goblinoid pantheon, they've got a few deities kicking around, but the most important one by far is Maglubiet. He is the archdeity of the goblinoid pantheon, and essentially became so by killing or subjugating all the other goblinoid gods. The lore surrounding what's going on with many of the goblinoid deities is sort of vague, but the primary takeaway here, if you condense all of this lore down into its finest point, is that M-Dog here reigns supreme, and he really hates Grumpsh, the god of orcs. If you've ever heard someone talk about how goblins and orcs traditionally don't get along, this is why. Maglubiet wants to destroy Grumpsh, and Grumpsh doesn't want that, so therefore, he's kind of forced into fighting a war with Maglubiet, hence why the afterlife of most orcs and most goblins is spent in a Valhalla-esque eternal battle between these two gods. There's a lot to unpack about the story, but just talking purely in broad strokes, Maglubiet's kind of a dick. He doesn't really care about the welfare of any of the goblinoid species, he just wants more soldiers for his war, so most of his actions are motivated by that. He is also the reason why goblins have a hierarchy that is organized with hobgoblins on the top and regular goblins at the bottom, with bugbears occupying a weird middle ground. And that raises a really interesting question. If the Vril are a true goblinoid species, where do they fit in with this spectrum of hierarchies? There's a lot of different ways they could fit in with goblinoid culture. They're obviously much more powerful and wise than standard goblins, and bugbears aren't really interested in power dynamics, they're just kind of doing their own thing over here. So how do they fit in with the hobgoblins? The way I see it, there are a few different ways this could play out, and all of them are interesting, equally but in different ways. Perhaps the Vril began worshipping Maglubiet with the hope of being welcomed into the goblinoid family, and as a god desperate for more soldiers, he welcomed them with open arms, at which point they fought a civil war against the hobgoblins for dominance. This war could be ongoing, or it may be resolved with the Vril either landing directly above or below hobgoblins on the totem pole, but in either case, the losing side of that battle is guaranteed to be constantly cloying for power, hoping to someday reach the top, either the hobgoblins seeking to reclaim what was taken from them, or the Vril seeking to attain what they see as their rightful place. Which is a really interesting political dynamic, because on paper, they should be allies, right? They're at least fighting for the same side. So if the goblins are all going to war under a unified banner, what choices might the Vril commanders make to achieve victory while undermining their hobgoblin superiors, or vice versa? Or maybe the Vril decide they don't even want to be part of the goblinoid structure and go off to do their own thing, vowing to never serve another master again. Maglubiet would probably be pretty pissed off about that and encourage the goblins who do follow him to kill the Vril, which means, as enemies of Maglubiet, the Vril may find an unlikely ally in the orcish peoples who follow Grumpsh. They could even become part of Grumpsh's host, or at the very least, a friend to the orcs. Or perhaps they do another thing. I don't know. They're an entire species of creatures. You could literally do both of those plots in the same world, where some of the Vril join the goblins, some of them join the orcs, and some of them stick with the drow, and then maybe some of them fuck off into the mountains to do their own thing. They could also make a cultural pact similar to the one made by the Death Giants in service to an eldritch entity or something. Who knows? This is a really unique group of creatures in that they have roots that go deep into an established lore stretching back millennia, at least in game terms, but there's practically nothing written about where they're going, which means we get to write that part, and I think that's kind of fun. I mean, Technically, they don't even have stats in an official product, but that's neither here nor there. I really encourage you to come up with your own stat blocks and your own take on Vril culture and how they kind of fit these pieces together within your world, because there are so many different possibilities, and I think all of them have equal potential to be really cool. Maybe their time under the rule of those evil wizards has made them despise evil and oppression, so they form a paladin-adjacent order within the Underdark, worshipping a god of freedom, and they roam the cavernous world they were born into, slaying all who would seek to oppress others. Or perhaps they decided they want to be the oppressors now, and they started subjugating regular goblins. And in literally any case, there's always room for individual Vril to break off and do their own thing. That's the beauty of intelligent, sentient creatures, is they're not robots, so each one of them is an individual capable of making choices. And if you think you might want to create a Vril NPC for your campaign, or better yet, you want to play as a Vril in the next game you're playing in, I've got amazing news for you. I also converted them as a 5e player species. If you choose to play as a Vril or create a specific NPC of any class who is a Vril, they'll get access to the Vril's Shriek, Skin Shift, and some other appropriate traits, including the resistance to thunder damage and the vulnerability to poison. It's definitely not going to be a species for everyone, but I think they've got some really cool and unique traits, and I wanted to put the option out there. And if all else fails, just use a group of Vril as the majority population in any dungeon, or as a group of bandits, or in place of any other antagonistic role that would normally be filled by goblins. Not only is it a bit of spice to add to an old classic, but it will be something new to catch veteran players off guard. Maybe within the game, the party hears whispers of goblins in the north, but these goblins are different. They're raiding villages at night, and the survivors recount tales of purple creatures with bat-like faces. And if you've got any drow in the party, they might even learn they're using drow battle tactics, which is especially weird for a group of goblins. It'll raise a lot of questions. And if the players do their research, not only will they be prepared to fight these new goblins, but they might even discover their weakness to poison and use it to their advantage. But however you choose to use these creatures, I have of course converted them to 5e, so all 3 Vril stat blocks which I've created and the player race option are linked in the Google document that is attached in the description down below. And if you are one of my lovely patrons, of course, over on the Dungeon Dad Patreon, you can find the high-res PDF stat block, which contains all the same game information, but it's got the new artwork attached to it and a bit nicer layout, just as my way of saying thank you for all your support. And speaking of patrons, it's time for Patron of the Week. Thank you so much to Ashton Clopton for clopping on over to my channel and throwing some extra support my way. It truly means the most. I appreciate you immensely. And thank you for watching. As always, if there's a monster you would like to see show up in a future episode of Monster of the Week, feel free to suggest that monster in the, I was about to say stats down below. Those aren't stats. In the comments down below, or over on the Dungeon Dad Discord, where we have a monster suggestions channel, and you might just see it show up on an episode of Monster of the Week. I hope you enjoyed this one. I really love these creatures. People who have been around for a long time know that hobgoblins are like my favorite entry-level enemy. So having another species of goblin to throw into the mix and see how they interact with hobgoblins and their culture and all that stuff was very exciting to me. It's pretty rare that I cover monsters that are this low CR on this channel, which isn't because the only good monsters exist at high CR, it's just I tend to gravitate more towards monsters that offer like something unique and that we haven't seen before, and a lot of low CR monsters are just kind of like an alternate spin on orcs or something. Which I guess is kind of what this is, but I felt their lore was interesting enough and their abilities and the way they function was different enough that it justified bringing them over to 5e. I also just like goblins. It's my channel, I get to do what I want. But anyways, thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Until then.
Dungeon Dad continues his journey through the Underdark, this time encountering a species of weird little fish guys. They don't seem to be all there between the gills, but at least they're not that threatening. Well, the small ones anyways. Next episode, Kuatoa Leviathan. Tune in next time for lots more fan service.